And that's phenomenon one. What that means for personality is that there's a personality style, aggressive, that may not have just been wired in, but instead that may be partly a result of social experiences. That's why these are called social cognitive theories. And even though there might be some, of course, innate aspect to aggression, there are large differences between societies and cultures. There are large differences across historical time periods in rates of aggression. There are historical cases where whole societies shift. My understanding is that Tibet shifts when Buddhism comes in from a relatively warlike to a very pacifistic society. The genetics of the people didn't shift quickly. The belief system of Buddhism changed the behavior. So one phenomenon that they look at is there's learning of behavior via what Bandura calls modeling. So as you'll see in the book also, the terms modeling and observational learning are used essentially synonymously for the learning of patterns of social behavior just by watching. And once you think about it, clearly a lot of stuff that we call personality may be the result of observing patterns of behavior so frequently that you essentially incorporate them as your own. And obviously we do lots of things. Styles of dress, styles of interaction would be completely different if we were born 200 years ago or in some other culture. Phenomenon two had to do with modeling as therapy. Almost all the personality theorists are also clinical psychologists. Though we haven't gotten to clinical psychology yet, almost all of them really except the trait theorists, start by observations in a clinical setting and then turn out to do formal research. Bandura realized that it might be that in cases in which the therapist is trying to reduce people's fear, you could capitalize on something that intuitively makes a lot of sense. If you're on an elevator and it makes a funny noise, and you tend to look at the person next to you, and if the person next to you looks calm, you immediately are much more calm than if the person next to you is screaming or grabbing some religious thing and praying or something. The other person's emotional reaction feed right into yours. It's an almost automatic kind of thing. In cases in which people experience what the psychologist calls phobias, a phobia being an irrational fear. If you have an irrational fear, you're in the majority. Almost huge numbers of people have a fear of something. Public speaking is the big winner. Driving across bridges, small animals, things that, if you're fearful of something where the probability of actually being harmed is near zero, but you're reacting to it as if it's threatening, that's a phobia. One of psychology's big successes is that one can pretty quickly reduce phobias, and we'll say how in a moment. What Bandura does is suggest you can do it through modeling being observing somebody else reacting calmly in the situation that makes you fearful. That's at least one component of reducing fears. Secondly, and it's the second idea here of social cognitive theory, and the part that makes it cognitive or thinking process related, is that Bandura suggests that it's not magical why these therapies work, and I'll say what one of the therapies are. Essentially, the prediction here is that therapies are working if they're changing the way people talk to themselves, the sort of things people say to themselves. That if you go into almost any situation telling yourself, things might go badly here, I'm going to look like an idiot, I don't know if I can handle this, that kind of self-talk can shoot yourself in the foot, so to speak, compared to talking to yourself in a self-confident way. In social cognitive theory, the term perceived self-efficacy, or synonymously self-efficacy beliefs in what I can do efficaciously, are predicted to be essentially the driver of psychological change. In essence, for these circumstances where people have extreme fears, the therapist's goal, so the story is here, is essentially to change the way people think about or talk to themselves. In addition to just saying that, Bandura does something that is not unique at the time he does it, but does it particularly well, and it's a major feature of psychology. Like if you drop everything and just have a normal major and don't major in psychology, it's useful to remember that when psychology in the university does therapy, it runs it through experimental tests in the same way that the biologist or the public health person will test a new drug. So what Bandura does, so that's what the self-efficacy is. Beliefs, subjective, meaning you could be right or you could be wrong. Your own personal beliefs about how well you can handle a given situation. What he does is to conduct research with people who are snake phobic. Perhaps I spent too much time on this illustration. Oh, I forgot about that part. Sorry. The reason for studying people who are snake phobic, there are actually a few extremely mundane reasons. If you want to run an experiment across a couple different days, you don't want to study people who are afraid of driving, because of course after the therapy session they may decide to drive home and be in an accident, and it messes up the experiment. Frankly, one of the incredibly practical reasons that a whole line of research studies snake phobics is that there aren't really that many snakes around here. Even when the research is done in a more rural setting, and it is in this case, and that's where snake phobia is more relevant. If you're afraid of snakes and your family's going on picnics, or your parking lot at the supermarket is next to a park that might have snakes, it's very actually debilitating to be spending your time worrying about snakes. And there are many people who are snake phobic. The advantage is they don't really run into snakes that often. You can run the study such that they're in the study one day, come back 2 days later, and it's pretty unlikely a snake fell out of the sky and hit him in the head. What Bandura does is to assign people who want a therapy for snake phobia to different experimental conditions. I'm doing this slowly because it's the first time we've seen this. So this is a good part of psychology. The way you test these therapies is you put out a little ad that says Stanford University is running a study that might help you with your snake phobia. 90 people sign up for the study after hearing the radio announcement. When they show up, they are assigned by flip of a three-sided coin to one of three conditions. A control condition in which they don't get any therapy. A quick aside, after the experiment's over, they do get therapy. The ethics of these studies are then, after they aren't just sent home to be afraid of snakes forever. You essentially are delaying their receipt of therapy. A condition that's called a modeling condition, in which they observe somebody else interacting with a snake. They get a non-poisonous snake. They're not, they know what they're doing. And the other person goes through a series of behaviors, takes it out of a cage while wearing gloves, take it out of the cage without wearing gloves, et cetera, and you just watch. Or, and this is the way people overcome fears, a participant modeling condition. So here, unlike a stereotype of what therapy is, the therapist does not just talk to the client. The therapy is very interactive. It's one in which the client is doing the thing that the person is afraid of. This is true for across phobias. If you're afraid of heights, your therapist takes you out to a 10-story parking garage and essentially drags you up the stairs to have the experience of conquering your fear. If you're afraid of driving across bridges, you drive across a bridge with the therapist. You don't just talk about driving across bridges. You participate in the event that makes you fearful. In participant modeling, you and the therapist, or the therapist who practically pulls you over to this little cage where they have a snake, you interact with it, the therapist hands it to you. This doesn't take long. Sometimes therapies go on a long time. This is like after a couple hours of therapy, you can test the hypothesis that therapy, this one will work, and should work if and only if it changes people's beliefs and their capabilities. So what Bandura does is to simply give little questionnaires. They're very straightforward, asking people their confidence in getting themselves to walk into a room in which there's a snake in a cage, walking to within 15 feet of it, walking within 5 feet of it, touching it while wearing a gloved hand, a big glove on your hand, touching it with your bare hand, picking it up, tying it into knots, whatever. So in the language of psychology that may show up on the exam, there's a dependent variable in the study, actually two, changes in what people think about themselves and changes in their behavior as a function of being in therapy. And this thing works remarkably well. So well that at first Bandura was challenged. People didn't believe the data, but then lots of people are able to replicate this. It was hard to believe this at first was because that number at the top of the scale is 100. That's a percentage of tasks on average that people can do while interacting with the snake, and the tasks range up to the ones I was saying. Take it out of the cage with your bare hand, toss it up in the air, and literally interact with the thing. Before therapy, of course, people can't do this, otherwise they don't need the therapy. Afterwards, people in the participant modeling condition can do this, and the changes in behavior are perfectly tracked by the way people talk about themselves. That is, the people who are in one therapy condition say things like, I think I can handle this now, and those are the people who, in fact, stick with it, overcome their fears, and there's huge, as things go in psychology, huge correlations between and within the experimental conditions, between the way people talk to themselves, the self-efficacy beliefs, and their changes in behavior. A lot of what happens in the world of human emotions is people thinking about the situations and talking to themselves really quickly, and this sort of self-talk drives a lot of either calmness versus emotional upset and anxiety. And putting aside the theory parts, this is also a domain where if you know somebody who's afraid of a specific thing, this is one psychologists can do. If you're afraid of snakes or dogs or heights or driving, psychology has a pretty good hit rate of helping you overcome those fears, not through magic, but through, as they say, getting back on the horse, if you're afraid of horses, and interacting with the thing you're afraid of. So that's 2. Here's the last, and the promised 3 phenomena